The stars had always called to humanity, whispering promises of discovery and adventure. For centuries, humans had gazed upward and wondered if they were alone in the vast darkness of space. The answer came on a cold morning in March when the United Earth ship Horizon crossed into the Vexton system and found a civilization that had been waiting there for thousands of years. Jake Morrison had been a ship captain for 15 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. He stood on the bridge of the Horizon, watching the view screen as an alien space station grew larger before them. The structure was enormous, built from materials that seemed to shift colors in the starlight. Hundreds of ships moved around it like insects around a hive, each one belonging to a species humanity had never imagined existed. His communications officer, a young woman named Amy Foster, turned to him with wide eyes. She had been monitoring the alien frequencies for hours, her translation software working overtime to make sense of the signals. The computer had finally cracked enough of the language to establish basic communication, and now an alien voice was requesting they identify themselves. Morrison straightened his uniform and nodded to Foster. She opened the channel, and suddenly they were looking at a being that seemed to be made of living crystal. Its body reflected light in rainbow patterns, and its eyes shifted through different colors as it studied them through the screen. The creature had 6 limbs and a body structure that defied everything Morrison knew about biology, the alien spoke, and the translation software converted its words into English with only a slight delay. It identified itself as Trademaster Vexler, an official of something called the Galactic Council. The tone was professional but cautious, asking where the human ship had come from and what it wanted in Council space. Morrison introduced himself and explained that humanity came from a planet called Earth in the Sol system. They had developed faster-than-light travel only recently and had followed alien radio signals to this location. They came in peace, hoping to establish contact with other intelligent species and perhaps join the galactic community. There was a long silence after Morrison finished speaking. The crystalline being's colors shifted to a pale shade that the translation software marked as indicating shock or distress. When Vexler spoke again, his voice carried a note of disbelief that transcended the language barrier. The alien explained that Earth was listed in their databases as a Class 12 death world. Such planets were considered extremely hostile to life, with conditions so harsh that no species had ever been known to evolve intelligence there, let alone develop space travel. The gravity was too strong, the atmosphere too toxic, the radiation too intense. By every measure the Council used, Earth should be lifeless. Morrison exchanged confused glances with his crew. To them, Earth was simply home. Yes, it could be dangerous, but that was just normal life. They had never considered that their planet might be unusual by galactic standards. Vexler told them to wait while he consulted with higher authorities. The screen went dark and the bridge crew sat in stunned silence. They had expected first contact to be historic, but they had not expected to be told they came from an impossible world. 3 days later, Morrison and a small team found themselves standing before the full Galactic Council. The chamber was vast, designed to accommodate dozens of different species with wildly different body types and environmental needs. The air itself seemed to hum with energy as translation technology worked to allow all the different beings to understand each other. The council speaker was a massive creature called a Horthek, standing nearly 3 meters tall with gray, leathery skin and 4 powerful arms. Its voice was deep and resonant as it welcomed the humans to the chamber. Around them sat representatives from 47 different species, and Morrison could feel the weight of their stares. Some looked curious, others nervous, and a few seemed openly frightened. The speaker asked how humanity had managed to survive on such a hostile world. Morrison's science officer, a man named Greg Palmer, stepped forward to explain. He described how humans had evolved over millions of years, adapting to Earth's high gravity by developing dense bones and powerful muscles. Their bodies had learned to process the oxygen-rich atmosphere that would be toxic to most galactic species. They had developed redundant organs and healing capabilities that allowed them to survive injuries that would kill others. As Palmer spoke, Morrison noticed more and more council members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. What Palmer was describing as simple biology sounded like the specifications for a combat machine to these peaceful aliens. They had spent thousands of years evolving in gentle, stable environments. They had no frame of reference for the kind of brutal natural selection that had shaped humanity. A reptilian delegate asked if the humans could demonstrate their physical capabilities. Morrison agreed, thinking it was a reasonable request. He had no idea he was about to change the galaxy forever. The medical facility on Vexton Prime was state-of-the-art, equipped to handle the biology of dozens of different species. The chief physician, a mantis-like creature named Kiltra, conducted a thorough examination of Amy Foster, who had volunteered to represent humanity. The doctor's shock was evident even through the translation of her clicking mandibles. Foster's skeleton was reinforced with mineral deposits that would serve as armor plating on a military vehicle. Her muscles were bundled in layers, providing redundancy and explosive power. She had multiple circulatory pathways, backup organs, and a healing factor that seemed almost magical to beings who took months to recover from minor injuries. When Kiltra asked about the liver, Foster casually mentioned it helped process alcohol and other toxins. The doctor was horrified to learn that humans deliberately consumed poison for recreation and their bodies had evolved specialized organs just to handle it. The real shock came during the physical testing. Kyle Peterson, the ship's security chief, was asked to run through an obstacle course that had been designed to challenge the absolute peak of physical ability across all known species. The course record was 18 minutes, set by a warrior from a species bred for combat. Peterson finished it in 4 minutes. He was barely breathing hard when he crossed the finish line. When asked if he was tired, he simply asked if there was a more difficult version available. The alien observers stood in stunned silence, their instruments confirming what their eyes could not quite believe. That evening, an emergency council session was called. The chamber buzzed with anxious conversation as representatives reviewed the data from the human assessments. Morrison and his team sat in an observation area, listening as the council debated what to do. About these powerful newcomers, some argued that humans should be welcomed as valuable allies. Others insisted they were too dangerous to be allowed into civilized space. The debate grew heated, with accusations and concerns flying back and forth. Morrison wanted to speak up, to defend his species, but protocol required him to remain silent until invited to address the council. Finally, the Horthic speaker raised a hand for silence. He turned to address Morrison directly, his 4 eyes showing concern and calculation in equal measure. The council would need time to deliberate on humanity's application for membership. In the meantime, humans would be granted provisional status and assigned a liaison to help them navigate. Galactic society, the unspoken message was clear. The council was afraid of what humanity might do. They had built a peaceful civilization over thousands of years, and suddenly a species of powerful, potentially aggressive beings had arrived on their doorstep. They wanted to believe humanity's claims of peaceful intentions, but fear was a powerful force. As Morrison and his crew left the council chamber, they could feel the eyes of hundreds of aliens watching them. Some species moved aside to let them pass, giving them a wide berth as if afraid to get too close. Others stared with open fascination, treating the humans like exotic and dangerous animals. Morrison understood their fear, even if it stung. Humanity had spent centuries fighting wars, building weapons, and perfecting the art of violence. Earth's history was written in blood and conflict. These peaceful aliens had every reason to be cautious, but Morrison also knew something they did not. Humanity had learned from its mistakes. They had built laws, established peace, and created societies based on cooperation rather than conquest. Yes, humans were strong. Yes, they came from a brutal world. But that did not make them monsters. It just made them survivors. And survival, Morrison was beginning to realize, was a skill the galaxy desperately needed. The weeks following the initial assessment were difficult for the human delegation. They had been assigned quarters in a diplomatic section of Vexton Prime, but the accommodations felt more like a gilded cage than a welcome. Other species avoided them in the corridors, and invitations to cultural exchanges were politely declined. The galaxy was watching humanity with a mixture of fascination and fear. Unwilling to get too close to the Deathworlders, Jake Morrison spent his days in meetings with various council officials, answering endless questions about human society, culture, and intentions. The questions always circled back to the same concerns. How often did humans engage in warfare? What weapons did they possess? How did they control their aggressive impulses? It felt less like diplomatic inquiry and more like a threat assessment. Amy Foster had taken to exploring the station during her off hours, trying to learn more about the species that made up the Galactic Council. She discovered that most of them came from worlds with gravity barely half that of Earth. Their atmospheres were gentler, their weather more predictable, their predators less dangerous. They had evolved in environments that nurtured rather than challenged them. She sat in a public garden one afternoon, watching alien children play under the careful supervision of their parents. The young ones were delicate, their movements graceful but fragile. A fall that would barely bruise a human child would send these parents rushing for medical care. It helped her understand why the Council was so frightened of humanity. To them, humans were walking natural disasters. Greg Palmer had buried himself in research, accessing the Council's vast historical databases. What he found both fascinated and troubled him. The galaxy had not always been peaceful. Thousands of years ago, the various species had fought brutal wars over resources and territory. Entire civilizations had been wiped out. Planets had been rendered uninhabitable. Then, gradually, peace had emerged. The survivors had formed the Council, establishing laws and norms that made cooperation more profitable than conflict. Trade replaced warfare. Diplomacy replaced violence. Over generations, the aggressive traits that had driven the ancient wars had been bred out or suppressed through cultural conditioning. The species of the Council had literally evolved to be peaceful. Humanity had not undergone that same transformation. They were still close to their violent past, still carrying the instincts and capabilities that the Council had spent millennia trying to forget. Palmer understood now why the aliens were so nervous. Looking at humans was like looking into a mirror that showed them their own ancestors, and they did not like what they saw. The debate in the Council dragged on for weeks. Morrison attended every session, watching as representatives argued passionately about humanity's fate. 23 species had voted in favor of membership, 19 opposed, and 5 abstained. The Council required a two-thirds majority for admission, which meant humanity was stuck in limbo. Then everything changed. On a quiet Tuesday morning, when a distress signal reached Vexton Prime, Morrison was in his quarters reviewing reports when Amy Foster burst through the door without knocking. Her face was pale, and she carried a datapad that showed emergency broadcasts from across the Council network. A mining colony called Zerith 7 had been attacked by raiders from the Krillian Empire. The Krillians were not part of the Council. They existed on the fringes of civilized space, occasionally attacking frontier settlements to steal resources and capture slaves. The Council had protocols for dealing with such incidents, but those protocols were designed for a civilized, peaceful galaxy. Morrison pulled up the tactical data and felt his blood run cold. The colony had 3,000 inhabitants, mostly families of miners and support workers. The Krillian attack force consisted of 3 warships and multiple boarding parties. The colonists were sending desperate pleas for help, but the Council's response fleet would not arrive for 10 days. In 10 days, everyone on that colony would be dead or enslaved. Morrison made his decision in seconds. He ordered his crew to battle stations and began preparing the horizon for immediate departure. Greg Palmer tried to argue that they did not have authorization, that acting without Council permission could destroy any chance of membership. Morrison listened to his friend's concerns and then dismissed them. He had not come to space to join a club that valued paperwork over lives. He had come to represent the best of what humanity could be. And the best of humanity did not sit idle while innocents died. The Horizon launched 30 minutes later, leaving behind a storm of protests from Council officials. Morrison knew he was gambling everything on this action. If they succeeded, maybe the Council would see humans as protectors rather than threats. If they failed, humanity's first contact with galactic civilization would end in disgrace. The journey to Zereth 7 took 18 hours at maximum speed. The Horizon's experimental engines strained under the load, but the human engineering crew kept them running beyond their rated capacity. When they finally dropped back into normal space near the colony, the situation was even worse than reported. The 3 Krillian warships circled the burning settlement like sharks, their weapons still firing into the defensive structures. Escape pods drifted in space, some damaged, some captured by Krillian tractor beams. On the surface, boarding parties were rounding up survivors for transport to their slave markets. Kyle Peterson studied the tactical display with a grim expression. Each Krillian cruiser was roughly twice the size of the Horizon. They had more weapons, heavier armor, and greater numbers. The Horizon was a science and exploration vessel, not a warship. It had 1 defensive railgun and basic shielding. By every military calculation, they were hopelessly outmatched, but Kyle had spent 20 years in the Earth military before joining the space program. He had learned that battles were not won by whoever had the biggest guns. They were won by whoever wanted it more and fought smarter. Morrison brought the Horizon screaming into the combat zone at a speed that made the Krillian ships scramble to respond. Human vessels, built to withstand Earth's crushing gravity, could pull maneuvers that would tear apart ships designed for gentler worlds. The Horizon jinked and twisted through space in patterns that should have been impossible. Morrison opened a communication channel to the Krillian fleet. His voice was calm and cold as he identified himself and ordered them to withdraw immediately. The Krillian commander responded with laughter and threats, clearly believing the single human ship posed no real danger. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took for the Horizon's railgun to fire its first shot. The weapon used principles that had fallen out of favor in galactic warfare. Most species used energy weapons, lasers, and particle beams that could be absorbed or deflected by proper shielding. The railgun was different. It fired a solid projectile, a slug of depleted uranium, at a significant fraction of light speed. The Krillian shields, optimized for energy weapons, might as well have not existed. The slug punched through the lead cruiser's defenses and tore through its hull, venting atmosphere and debris into space. Alarm screamed on the Krillian bridge as critical systems failed. Morrison gave them one more chance to withdraw. His tone made it clear this was the final warning. The Krillians, suddenly aware that they were not facing an easy target, began pulling back their boarding parties and retreating toward the edge of the system. As the last Krillian ship jumped away, Morrison allowed himself to breathe again. They had won, but he knew the real challenge was just beginning. The Horizon moved into position above the colony, and rescue operations began immediately. The colony administrator was a small Ventaxi who trembled with relief as she thanked Morrison over the communication channel. She explained that the Krillians had been separating families, taking the young and strong for slavery and planning to leave the rest to die. Another hour and it would have been too late. Morrison accepted her thanks with quiet dignity, but his mind was already racing ahead to what would happen when they returned to Vexton Prime. He had acted without authorization, engaged in military action, and violated numerous council protocols. He might have just ended humanity's chances of joining galactic civilization, but he had saved 3,000 lives. Whatever consequences came next, Morrison knew he would make the same choice again. The crew of the Horizon worked through the night, coordinating with the colonists to provide medical care, temporary shelter, and repairs to critical systems. Amy Foster organized supply distribution while Greg Palmer helped triage the injured. Kyle Peterson set up a defensive perimeter just in case the Krillians decided to return. As dawn broke over Zereth 7, Morrison stood on the surface of the colony and watched the local star rise. The colonists moved around him, already beginning the work of rebuilding. Children played in the temporary shelters, their parents watching with the grateful exhaustion of people who had come too close to losing everything. An elderly Horthic approached Morrison, moving slowly with age. He introduced himself as Geth, the colony's chief engineer. He had lived on Zero 7 for 50 years, building a life and raising a family in this remote corner of space. The Krillians had destroyed much of what he had built, but his family was alive because the humans had come. Geth wanted to know why Morrison had risked everything. The docking bay at Vexton Prime was crowded when the Horizon arrived. News of the rescue at Zero 7 had spread through the galactic network like wildfire, and it seemed like half the station had come to see the human ship return. Security personnel struggled to maintain order as hundreds of beings pressed forward, some holding recording devices, others simply staring in wonder at the vessel that had done the impossible. Jake Morrison walked down the boarding ramp with his crew behind him, and the crowd fell silent. He expected to see anger or fear in the faces around him. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like hope. The survivors of Zero 7 had transmitted everything, including video footage of the battle and interviews with the rescued colonists. The galaxy had watched humans fight and win against overwhelming odds. Council security escorted Morrison and his senior staff directly to an emergency session. The atmosphere in the council chamber was electric with tension. Representatives whispered among themselves, and Morrison could feel dozens of eyes tracking his movement as he took his position in the center of the room. The Horthic speaker stood, his forearms spread wide for silence. His voice was grave as he addressed the gathering. Morrison had acted without authorization, he said. The human captain had violated council protocols, engaged in military action in council space, and potentially started a diplomatic incident with the Krillian Empire. These were serious charges that could not be ignored. A Sethian representative, one of those who had opposed human membership from the start, rose to speak. His reptilian features were twisted with anger as he pointed an accusatory claw at Morrison. This was exactly the kind of behavior they had feared from humans, he said. Violence as a first resort. Unilateral action without consultation. The arrogance to believe they knew better than the collective wisdom of the council. Morrison felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent. He had known this would be difficult, but hearing his actions described as reckless and dangerous still stung. He had saved 3,000 lives. How could that be wrong? Then Greg Palmer stepped forward and asked permission to speak. The council granted it, and Palmer addressed them with quiet passion. He reminded them that Captain Morrison had not sought conflict. The war had already started when the Krillians attacked the colony. All Morrison had done was end it before more innocents could be harmed. Amy Foster joined him, pointing out that Morrison had given the Krillians multiple chances to withdraw peacefully. He had used diplomacy first, and force only when it became clear that words would not stop the attack. Was that not the correct approach? Should they have simply watched while an entire colony was enslaved? Kyle Peterson spoke next, his military background evident in his precise language. He walked the council through the tactical decisions, explaining how Morrison had minimized casualties on both sides. The Krillian ships had been disabled, not destroyed. Their crews had survived. If Morrison had truly been a warmonger, as some suggested, the outcome would have been far more violent. The debate raged for hours. Some council members praised the human intervention, calling it heroic and necessary. Others condemned it as a dangerous precedent that could undermine the peaceful foundation of galactic society. The arguments grew heated, with representatives shouting over each other in multiple languages that the translation system struggled to keep up with. Then an elderly Horthic rose slowly from her seat. Magistrate Tellin was one of the founders of the modern council, a living legend who rarely spoke in sessions anymore. When she began to talk, the chamber fell silent out of respect for her age and wisdom. Tellin spoke about the early days of the council, when it had been formed in the aftermath of devastating wars. The founders had been determined to create a peaceful society, to leave behind the violence that had nearly destroyed them all. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, building a civilization where disputes were settled through words rather than weapons. But in that success, Tellin said, they had become soft. They had forgotten that peace must sometimes be defended with strength. They had built a beautiful society and left it unguarded, assuming that everyone in the galaxy shared their values. The Krillian attacks had proven that assumption wrong. She turned to look directly at Morrison. His actions had been technically improper, she acknowledged. But they had also been morally correct. He had seen beings in danger and acted to protect them, regardless of the personal cost. That was not the behavior of a warmonger. It was the behavior of a guardian. Taylin asked the council a simple question. What did they see when they looked at the humans? Did they see monsters who would destroy their peace? Or did they see protectors who could defend what they had built? The answer to that question would determine not just humanity's fate, but the future of the entire galactic civilization. The magistrate called for a vote on human membership. The chamber fell silent as representatives registered their decisions. Morrison watched the holographic display as the votes were tallied in real time. His heart pounded in his chest, knowing that centuries of human dreams rode on this moment. The final count appeared. 34 votes in favor, 11 opposed, 2 abstained. Humanity had achieved the two-thirds majority needed for full council membership, but Magistrate Tellen was not finished. She proposed the creation of a new organization called the Galactic Defense Initiative. Its purpose would be to protect council members from external threats and respond quickly to emergency situations. And she suggested that humanity should lead this initiative, teaching other species what the Deathworlders knew about defense and protection. The proposal shocked the chamber into silence. They were not just accepting humans into the council. They were asking them to become the galaxy's guardians. It was an enormous responsibility and a profound statement of trust. Morrison felt the weight of that trust settle on his shoulders. He looked at his crew, seeing the same mixture of pride and concern on their faces. Then he addressed the council, making one thing absolutely clear. Humans would not be soldiers for hire. They would not become the council's attack dogs. If they accepted this role, it would be as partners and equals. They would share their knowledge, train willing volunteers, and build a real defense force together. Magistrate Tellen smiled, her weathered features creasing with satisfaction. She said she would expect nothing less from beings who understood both the necessity of strength and the responsibility it carried. The session ended with humanity officially welcomed into the galactic community. Morrison and his crew were surrounded by well-wishers as they left the chamber. Some of the same beings who had avoided them weeks earlier now pressed forward to shake their hands or perform equivalent gestures of respect, but not everyone was celebrating. The Sethian representative watched from a distance, his cold eyes tracking Morrison's movement. He believed humans were a threat, and nothing that had happened today changed his mind. He would be watching, waiting for the Deathworlders to reveal their true nature that evening. Morrison stood alone in an observation deck, looking out at the stars. The station hummed with life around him, thousands of beings from dozens of worlds going about their business. They were counting on humanity now, whether they fully realized it or not. The weight of that responsibility was immense. Greg Palmer found him there an hour later. The scientist looked troubled, his usual enthusiasm tempered by concern. He voiced the worry that had been nagging at Morrison all day. They were about to teach the galaxy how to fight. What if that knowledge was misused? What if they turned this peaceful civilization into something violent? Morrison had been thinking about that same question. He told Palmer about something he had learned during his years in Earth's military. Strength without wisdom led to tyranny. Power without compassion led to cruelty. But the answer was not to remain weak and hope for the best. The answer was to be strong and teach others to use that strength. Responsibly, humans had spent centuries learning that lesson the hard way. They had fought terrible wars and built horrible weapons. They had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times. But they had also learned to control their violent impulses, to channel their strength toward protection rather than conquest. That knowledge, painful as it had been to acquire, was what they could offer the galaxy. Palmer wanted to believe that, but doubt still lingered in his eyes. Morrison understood. They were taking a gamble on a galactic scale. They were betting that they could teach the Council to defend itself without teaching it to become aggressive. It was a fine line to walk, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. but Morrison also knew they had no choice. The galaxy needed guardians, whether it wanted them or not. The Krillians were just one threat among many. As the Council expanded and prospered, it would inevitably encounter others who saw weakness as opportunity. Better to prepare now than to wait until it was too late. Amy Foster joined them at the observation window, carrying datapads with preliminary plans for the training program. She had been thinking about how to teach defense without promoting aggression. The key, she believed, was to focus on protection rather than conquest. They would train people to defend their homes and families, not to attack others. Kyle Peterson arrived with tactical assessments of Council space. 3 months had passed since the Council voted to create the Galactic Defense Initiative, and the transformation was remarkable. What had started as a controversial idea had become the most ambitious project in recent galactic history. Training facilities had been established on 3 different worlds, and volunteers were arriving daily from across Council space. Amy Foster stood in the main training hall on Vexton Prime, watching a group of recruits struggle through what humans would consider a basic obstacle course. The squad consisted of 5 beings from different species, each with unique physical capabilities and limitations. A small Ventaxi named Myrn was attempting to climb a rope wall, his tiny hands barely able to grip the thick fibers designed for larger species. Foster watched as Myrn made it halfway up before his strength gave out. He hung there for a moment, trembling with effort before losing his grip and falling onto the safety mat below. The small alien lay there, breathing hard, clearly believing he had failed. Foster jogged over and knelt beside him. She had learned over the past months that different species required different approaches to training. What motivated a human might discourage a Ventaxi and vice versa. She helped Myrn to his feet and spoke to him gently. She explained that she was not trying to turn him into a human. His species had different strengths. Ventaxi had reflexes twice as fast as humans and eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously. He would never be a frontline soldier, but he could be an exceptional tactical coordinator, seeing patterns in battle that humans would miss. Myrn looked up at her with his large, dark eyes. He asked if that meant he was not a failure. Foster smiled and told him that failure was not trying, not struggling with a task that did not suit his abilities. She was helping him find where he belonged in the defense initiative, and that process took time. The young Ventaxi stood a little straighter, encouraged by her words. He asked what he should do next, and Foster directed him to a tactical simulation room where his natural talents would shine. As she watched him scurry away with renewed purpose, she felt a surge of satisfaction. This was working. Slowly, painfully, but it was working. Across the station, Dr. Lisa Barnes taught a very different kind of lesson. She stood before a classroom of senior council security officers, most of whom had decades more experience than she did. They had come expecting to learn about human weapons and combat techniques. Instead, Barnes was teaching them about strategic thinking and threat assessment. She explained that the Council's security model was entirely reactive. They waited for problems to occur and then responded, which worked fine for trade disputes and natural disasters. It failed catastrophically against organized aggression. The Krillian attack on Zereth 7 had proven that a Shithari officer raised a claw and asked if Barnes was suggesting preemptive strikes. The concern in his voice was clear. Such actions seemed contrary to everything the Council stood for. Barnes shook her head and clarified her point. She was not advocating for unprovoked attacks. She was suggesting the development of intelligence networks that could identify threats before they materialized. Early warning systems that gave them time to prepare. Diplomatic channels that could diffuse tensions before they exploded into violence. And yes, when absolutely necessary, the capability to respond with decisive force to protect innocent lives. She pulled up a map showing Krillian territory. Since the incident at Zereth 7, Krillian raiding had stopped completely. Not because their fleet had been destroyed, but because they now knew the Council could and would respond. That was deterrence, Barnes explained. It prevented conflict rather than causing it. The officers listened with growing understanding. This was a fundamental shift in how they thought about security. For thousands of years, the Council had relied on the assumption that everyone wanted peace. The humans were teaching them to prepare for those who did not share that assumption. Greg Palmer had taken charge of the technical side of the Defense Initiative. He worked with engineers from a dozen different species to adapt human technology for galactic use. The railgun that had proven so effective against Krillian shields was being studied and refined. Defensive systems were being upgraded. Ship designs were being modified to handle the kind of aggressive maneuvering that human pilots used instinctively, but Palma was careful to share rather than impose. He made it clear that humans were not the only ones with valuable knowledge. The Chithari had developed sensor technology far superior to anything Earth had created. The Korvaxi understood energy dynamics in ways that could revolutionize human engineering. By combining the best of all species, they could create something greater than any one civilization could achieve alone. Jake Morrison, now officially Commodore Morrison, oversaw the entire operation from his new office in the Defense Initiative headquarters. He had been promoted and given command of a small fleet. The Horizon had been joined by two newly constructed vessels, the Guardian and the Sentinel, each built using hybrid human-alien technology, but ships and technology were not enough. Morrison knew that the real strength of any defense force lay in the people who served in it. He spent hours reviewing personnel files, meeting with trainees, and working to build a culture that balanced human determination with galactic wisdom. One afternoon, a young Horthic named Kethis came to Morrison's office. The recruit had been struggling with the physical training, and his instructors had recommended he be transferred to a support role. But Kethis insisted he wanted to be a field operative, to actually serve on defensive missions. Morrison studied the young alien, seeing the determination in his 4 eyes. He asked why it mattered so much to Kethis, why he was willing to push himself so hard when he could serve equally well in other capacities. Kethis explained that his family lived on a frontier colony similar to Zereth 7. They were vulnerable, exposed, and until recently unprotected. He had joined the Defense Initiative to ensure that what happened to Zereth 7 never happened to his home. He could not do that from behind a desk. Morrison understood that motivation. It was the same drive that had pushed him to become a soldier back on Earth, the need to protect the people he cared about. He told Kethis that determination was important, but so was realistic assessment of abilities. Then he asked what Kethis was best at. Setting aside the question of what he wanted to be best at, the young Horthic thought for a moment, then admitted he had always been good at organizing things, at seeing how different pieces fit together into efficient systems. Morrison smiled and told him that was exactly the kind of thinking they needed in field operations. A coordinator who could manage resources, position personnel, and adapt plans on the fly was worth 10 soldiers who could only follow orders. Kethis left the office with a new sense of purpose. Assigned to a specialized training track for field coordinators, Morrison watched him go, thinking about how many others like him were finding their place in this new organization. They were building something unprecedented, a defense force that valued every species' unique contributions rather than trying to force everyone into the same mold, but not everyone was happy with the changes. The Sethian representative, whose name was Vexkal, had been vocal in his opposition to the Defense Initiative from the start. He believed humans were corrupting the peaceful nature of galactic civilization, teaching aggression and preparing for wars that need not happen. Vexkal gathered a coalition of like-minded representatives who shared his concerns. They began a campaign to limit the Defense Initiative's authority, arguing that the organization had too much power and not enough oversight. They wanted restrictions on training, limits on military technology, and regular reviews that could dissolve the initiative. If it was deemed unnecessary, Morrison was called before the Council to address these concerns. He stood in the same chamber where humanity had been judged months earlier, now defending the organization they had been asked to create. The irony was not lost on him. Vexkal spoke first, outlining his objections with cold precision. He acknowledged that the Defense Initiative had prevented several minor incidents, but argued that the cost was too high. The Council was changing, he said, becoming more militaristic, more suspicious, more like the violent civilizations they had left behind. Morrison listened carefully, recognizing that Vexgull's concerns were not entirely without merit. Then he responded, choosing his words with care. He agreed that vigilance was needed to ensure the defense initiative did not become what it was meant to guard against. Oversight was appropriate and welcome, but Morrison also pointed out a simple truth. The galaxy was not as safe as the Council had believed. The Krillian Empire was just one threat among many. As the Council expanded and prospered, it would inevitably encounter others who saw opportunity in their weakness. Hoping for the best was not a strategy. Preparing for the worst, while working toward the best, was the only responsible approach. He pulled up data showing a sharp decline in frontier raids and attacks since the defense initiative became operational. Colonies that had lived in fear now slept peacefully. Trade routes that had been hazardous were now secure. The initiative was not looking for conflicts. It was preventing them through demonstrated capability and readiness, Magistrate Tellon spoke. 6 months into the defense initiative's operation, a new threat emerged that would test everything humans and their alien partners had built together. Intelligence reports began showing unusual activity along the border between Council space and the territory of the Vrex Collective, a species known for aggressive expansion and territorial conquest. The Vrex were different from the Krillians. Where the Krillians were raiders and pirates, the Vrex were empire builders. They did not attack for resources or slaves. They attacked to expand their territory and assert dominance over their neighbors. They had been quiet for several years, but now their fleets were gathering near Council borders. Jake Morrison sat in the command center of the Guardian, reviewing the intelligence data with growing concern. His tactical officer, a human named Ryan Hayes, had been tracking Vrex movements for 3 weeks. The pattern was unmistakable. They were preparing for a major military operation. Lisa Barnes, who had become the initiative's chief intelligence analyst, briefed the command staff on what they knew about the Vrex. They were large, crustacean-like beings with thick exoskeletons that served as natural armor. They were strong, aggressive, and had a military tradition going back thousands of years. Unlike most Council species, the Vrex had never abandoned warfare as a tool of policy. The question facing Morrison was how to respond. The Vrex had not actually attacked yet. Their fleet buildup could be interpreted as defensive rather than offensive. But waiting until they crossed the border would mean giving up the initiative and potentially allowing them to strike the first blow against unprepared colonies. Greg Palmer argued for a diplomatic approach. They should reach out to the Vrex leadership and try to understand their intentions. Perhaps there were grievances that could be addressed through negotiation. War should always be the last option, not the first. Amy Foster suggested a demonstration of force. They should position the Defense Initiative fleet near the border in a clear defensive posture. Let the Vrex see that the Council was no longer an easy target. Sometimes the best way to prevent a war was to make the potential cost clear before the first shot was fired. Morrison listened to both arguments and made his decision. They would do both. Palmer would lead a diplomatic team to contact the Vrex and attempt negotiations. Meanwhile, Morrison would take the fleet to the border and establish a defensive position. If diplomacy failed, they would be ready to respond. 3 days later, the Guardian, Sentinel, and Horizon dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Council space. They were joined by 3 Council defense cruisers, each crewed by mixed-species teams trained in the new defensive protocols. The combined fleet positioned itself directly across from the Vrex formation, which consisted of 7 heavy warships. Morrison opened a communication channel to the Vrex fleet. His message was direct but not hostile. He identified himself and his purpose, noting the Vrex buildup near Council borders and requesting clarification of their intentions. He kept his tone professional, giving no hint of fear or aggression. The response came several minutes later. The Vrex commander appeared on screen, a massive being with a shell that gleamed like polished bronze. His mandibles clicked as he spoke, the translation rendering his words with a harsh, grating quality. He had heard of Morrison and the humans, he said. Their reputation for violence was well known. but the Vrex outnumbered the Council fleet 7-1. Morrison could not stop them if they chose to advance. Morrison acknowledged the numbers disparity calmly. Then he transmitted detailed tactical data to the Vrex fleet. The information showed that the Defense Initiative had targeting solutions for every Vrex ship, knew the weaknesses in their shield configurations, understood their weapon ranges and reload times, and had identified exploitable flaws in their tactical formations. Morrison explained that if the situation became a battle, the Vrex would lose, their ships would be destroyed, their military capability crippled, and their economy damaged. Rivals would see that weakness and move against them. And all of this could happen in the next few hours if they chose to proceed with hostilities, but, Morrison continued, it did not have to be a battle. They could stand down and talk. Perhaps there were legitimate grievances that could be addressed through diplomatic channels. Perhaps there was a solution that did not require thousands of deaths on both sides. The choice belonged to the Vrex. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Morrison could see his own crew holding their breath, waiting to see if words would be enough or if they would have to back up those words with action. The other Council ships reported ready status, their weapons charged and shields at maximum. Finally, the Vrex commander spoke again. His tone had changed, carrying a note of what might have been respect. He said that humans were a strange species, threatening overwhelming force in one breath and offering peace in the next. It was not how the Vrex normally conducted negotiations. Morrison replied that humans understood both war and peace intimately. They had fought terrible conflicts and built lasting truces. They knew the cost of violence and the value of diplomacy. That experience had taught them to prefer negotiation but be prepared for confrontation. The Vrex commander considered this, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that Barnes later identified as indicating careful thought. Then he announced that the Vrex fleet would power down weapons as a gesture of good faith. They were willing to hear what the Council had to offer. Relief washed over the Bridge of the Guardian, though Morrison was careful not to show it. He thanked the Vrex commander for his wisdom and confirmed that diplomatic teams were ready to begin discussions immediately. The crisis had been averted without a single shot being fired. Over the next week, negotiations proceeded in a station hastily established in neutral space. Greg Palmer led the Council delegation, working with Vrex representatives to understand their concerns and find common ground. It turned out that the Vrex expansion plans were driven partly by resource needs and partly by pressure from their own population for new territories. Palmer proposed a series of trade agreements that would provide the Vrex with access to resources they needed without requiring territorial conquest. He also suggested a joint colonization program where the Vrex and Council could work together to develop uninhabited systems, giving the Vrex the expansion opportunities their culture demanded while maintaining peaceful relations. The negotiations were difficult and sometimes contentious. The Vrex were not naturally inclined toward cooperation, and there were moments when it seemed the whole process would collapse. But Palmer persisted, finding creative solutions to seemingly impossible demands. After 7 days of intense discussion, an agreement was reached. The treaty was signed in a ceremony attended by representatives from both sides. The Vrex committed to respecting Council borders and participating in joint economic and colonial ventures. The Council agreed to fair trade terms and recognized the Vrex's legitimate need for expansion. It was not a perfect solution, but it was far better than the alternative. Morrison attended the ceremony, standing in the back of the room as Palmer and the Vrex ambassador signed the historic document. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction watching diplomacy succeed where force would have led only to destruction. This was what the Defense Initiative was truly about. Not fighting wars but preventing them. After the ceremony, the Vrex commander sought out Morrison privately. The large alien regarded the human with his multifaceted eyes, his posture indicating curiosity rather than hostility. He wanted to understand how humans could be so effective at both war and peace. Most species, he said, were good at one or the other, but rarely both. Morrison thought about the question carefully before answering. He explained that humans had learned through painful experience that strength alone was not enough. Pure military power without wisdom led to destruction. But wisdom without strength left you vulnerable to those who chose violence over reason. The key was having both and knowing when to use which. The Vrex commander absorbed this, then asked another question. How did Morrison know his threats were not empty boasts? The Vrex fleet might have won the battle despite the humans' confidence. Why risk peace on such uncertainty? Morrison smiled slightly and admitted that he had not been certain of victory. War was chaotic and absolute certainty was impossible. But he had been confident enough to make the threat credible. And more importantly, he had been willing to follow through if necessary. That willingness, he said, was what made deterrence work. The Vrex had seen that Morrison would fight if forced to, which made peaceful resolution much more attractive. The Vrex commander clicked his mandibles in what Morrison now recognized as their version of laughter. He said that humans were indeed strange and dangerous, but perhaps that was what the galaxy needed. Peaceful species had built a wonderful civilization, but they had forgotten how to defend it. The Deathworlders remembered, and that memory might save them all. Back on Vexton Prime, news of the successful negotiations spread quickly. The Council held a special session to commend both the Defense Initiative for their deterrent presence and the diplomatic team for their negotiation skills. It was exactly the outcome Morrison had hoped for, showing that strength and diplomacy could work together rather than egg. 1 year had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Council, and the transformation was complete. The Defense Initiative had grown from a controversial experiment into an essential institution that protected over 50 inhabited worlds and countless space stations. What had started with 4 humans and a single ship had become a fleet of 20 vessels crewed by beings from 30 different species. Jake Morrison stood in the newly completed Defense Initiative headquarters on Vexton Prime, reviewing the latest operational reports. The building itself was a symbol of how far they had come. It incorporated architectural elements from a dozen different cultures, a physical representation of the cooperative spirit that now defined the organization. The biggest change was not visible in ships or buildings, but in attitudes. The species that had once feared human strength now competed to join the Defense Initiative. Training facilities on 3 worlds were turning away applicants because they could not accommodate everyone who wanted to serve. The Deathworlders had become heroes. Their reputation transformed from threatening to inspiring, but Morrison knew that reputation was fragile. One mistake, one abuse of power, and everything they had built could collapse. He thought about this constantly, especially during the quiet moments when he could reflect on the responsibility he carried. Amy Foster had risen to become the lead instructor for the Initiative's training program. She had developed a comprehensive curriculum that adapted to each species' unique abilities while teaching universal principles of defense and protection. Her success rate was remarkable, with over 90% of recruits completing the program and moving into active service. She had also become something of a legend among the younger council species. Stories of the human who could outrun Korvaxi warriors and outthink Chithuri tacticians spread through the training centers. But Foster used her reputation carefully, always emphasizing teamwork over individual achievement and humility over pride. One morning, she received a visit from a young Ventaxi named Cree, who had just graduated top of his class in tactical coordination. Cree wanted to thank Foster personally for believing in him when his own people had doubted. Ventaxi were small and physically weak by galactic standards, and many assumed they had nothing to contribute to defense efforts. Foster had seen past those assumptions to recognize Cree's exceptional strategic mind. She had trained him not as a soldier but as a battlefield coordinator, someone who could manage complex operations and see patterns that others missed. In simulations, Cree had demonstrated abilities that surpassed even the most experienced human officers. She told Cree that his success was his own achievement, not hers. She had simply helped him find the right role. But Cree insisted that without her vision of what defense could be, of how every species had something valuable to offer, he would never have had the chance to serve. Greg Palmer had become the Initiative's chief technology officer. overseeing the development and integration of defensive systems across Council space. His work had produced remarkable innovations by combining human engineering principles with alien technologies. Defensive shields were now 40% more effective. Sensor arrays could detect threats at twice the previous range. Communication systems were more secure and reliable, but Palma's greatest achievement was building a culture of collaboration among scientists and engineers from different species. He had created research teams where Chitauri sensor specialists worked, alongside human weapons designers and Horthak structural engineers. The synergy produced breakthroughs that no single species could have achieved alone. Palmer often reflected on how much he had learned from his alien colleagues. Humans had assumed their technology was cutting edge, but the truth was more complex. Earth had developed certain capabilities to extreme levels out of necessity, but other species had focused on different challenges and produced equally impressive solutions. By sharing knowledge freely, everyone benefited. Kyle Peterson had taken command of the initiative's Rapid Response Force, a specialized unit designed to handle emergency situations anywhere in Council space. His team could deploy within hours of a distress call, arriving with the equipment and expertise needed to address whatever crisis they encountered. Peterson's force had responded to 17 incidents in the past year, ranging from pirate attacks to natural disasters. They had rescued colonists from a failing life support system on a remote mining station. They had evacuated a research facility threatened by volcanic activity. They had deterred 3 separate attempts at unauthorized territorial expansion by aggressive neighbors. Each successful mission reinforced the value of the defense initiative and demonstrated that military capability could serve humanitarian purposes. Peterson was careful to ensure his team always operated within Council laws and respected the sovereignty of the worlds they protected. They were helpers, not invaders. Lisa Barnes had built the initiative's intelligence network into one of the most effective information-gathering operations in the galaxy. She had agents and contacts across dozens of systems, providing early warning of potential threats before they could develop into crises. Her work was invisible to most Council members, but it was essential to maintaining the peace they enjoyed. Barnes had also established protocols to prevent the intelligence network from becoming a tool of oppression. All surveillance was focused on external threats, never on Council members themselves. Information was shared openly with relevant authorities rather than hoarded for political advantage. She understood that trust was built through transparency, not secrecy. One afternoon, Barnes briefed Morrison on a concerning pattern she had identified. Several frontier regions were reporting increased activity by unknown vessels that did not match any known species signatures. The ships appeared to be conducting reconnaissance, mapping Council space, and cataloging defensive capabilities. Morrison asked if she had any theories about who might be behind the surveillance. Barnes admitted she did not, which troubled her. In the year since the initiative began operations, she had become familiar with all the major and minor powers in the region. These vessels belonged to someone new, someone who had been watching from a distance and was now taking a closer interest. Morrison ordered increased patrols in the affected regions and instructed Barnes to prioritize identifying the unknown visitors. If a new player was entering the game, they needed to understand their intentions before making assumptions. The galaxy was vast, and humanity's experience represented only a tiny fraction of what existed in the darkness between stars. The Council held its annual assembly that month, a week-long gathering where representatives from all member species discussed policy, resolved disputes, and celebrated their shared achievements. The defense initiative was a major topic of discussion, with several presentations highlighting its successes over the past year. Magistrate Tellin, now even more frail but still sharp of mind, gave a speech praising the initiative and the humans who led it. She spoke of her initial fears when the Deathworlders first arrived, how she had wondered if inviting them into the Council would destroy the peace her generation had worked so hard to build, but those fears had proven unfounded. Humanity had brought strength without aggression, military capability without militarism. They had taught the galaxy that being prepared for conflict was not the same as seeking conflict. They had shown that the strongest protectors often came from the harshest environments because they understood survival in ways that sheltered species could not. Talon's speech received a standing ovation from most of the assembly, though Morrison noticed that Vexkel and a handful of other skeptics remained seated. The Sethian representative still believed humans were a corrupting influence, still watched for any sign that the Deathworlders would reveal their true nature. Morrison accepted that some beings would never trust humanity, no matter what they did. All he could do was continue proving them wrong through consistent action and ethical behavior. Trust was earned through demonstrated reliability over time, not through words or promises. During a break in the assembly proceedings, Morrison was approached by a Korvaxi diplomat named Thress. The Korvaxi were one of the species that had most enthusiastically embraced cooperation with humans, recognizing a kindred warrior spirit. Despite the vast physical and cultural differences between the two species, Thress wanted to discuss the unknown vessels Barnes had detected. The Korvaxi had encountered similar ships near their own borders decades ago, before joining the Council. The vessels had observed them for several months before disappearing without making contact. Thress had always wondered who they were and what they wanted. Morrison asked if the Korvaxi had tried to intercept or communicate with the vessels. Thress explained that they had attempted both, but the unknown ships were faster than anything the Korvaxi possessed. They vanished the moment pursuit began, as if they had been waiting for exactly that response. This information troubled Morrison. If the vessels were that advanced, it suggested they belonged to a civilization with technology superior to anything in Council space. That could mean many things, some benign and others deeply concerning. He thanked Thress for the information and promised to share anything the initiative learned. That evening,